All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to give it just one more minute, 30 seconds before we get started, give everyone enough time to get logged on. Thank you all so much for being here. We are super excited to have you. And so we'll just give it another few seconds. I see the participant number continuing to grow up, so we'll just give it a second here. All right, I see the participant list kind of steadying out, so I will go ahead and get us started. Thank you so much for joining the American Immigration Council today for our webinar, State and Local Strategies for Strengthening Communities and Protecting Immigrants. I'm Victoria Francis, Deputy Director of State and Local Initiatives at the Council, and I'll be your host. Today we'll be talking about the current state of immigration in the U.S., including the impact of the dramatic expansion of immigration enforcement across the country and the threats facing local communities. We'll discuss how, despite immigration policies, who can and cannot come to the U.S. and who can stay being set at the federal level, state and local leaders play a crucial role in advancing policies that support their immigrant communities and promote local safety. This webinar will provide an overview of the current threats facing immigrants and protective policy options available to state and local policymakers. Before we kick things off, I want to draw your attention to the Q&A button. Please use this to submit your questions throughout the webinar. This can also be done anonymously using the Q&A button. We'll have time after our speakers present for Q&A from the audience. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be shared out afterwards. We will also share information about the policies that are discussed. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today we have 4 incredible panelists who will share their expertise, help you to understand the current landscape around immigration enforcement and immigrant rights, the need for state and local leaders to take action, and what policy options are available. Kicking us off will be Nayna Gupta, Policy Director at the American Immigration Council. Nayna will walk us through the current landscape, including the whole of government approach to immigration enforcement at this moment. We'll then turn to our state experts to discuss policy solutions. First, we'll hear from Gladis Ibarra, Co-Executive Director at the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, about Colorado's years-long efforts to protect immigrant data. Then Susan Church, Chief Operating Officer and Legal Advisor for the Massachusetts Office of Refugees and Immigrants. She'll share how the state is working to meet the immigration legal service needs of its community. And finally, Helen Salida, Campaign Manager at the American Civil Liberties Union of Delaware. She'll talk about Delaware's 2025 efforts to prohibit 287G agreements with ICE, U.S. Customs, and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Nayna to get us started. Nayna?
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. Nayna Gupta. I'm the Policy Director here at the American Immigration Council. Thanks for joining us. So I'm here to offer just an update on where we are from the federal policy perspective when it comes to mass deportation and this administration's agenda, which can really be described as cruel, chaotic, and indiscriminate. This is an administration that has abdicated the use of immigration enforcement priorities. Priorities have been used by all prior presidential administrations in modern history from both political parties. And when there are no enforcement priorities, effectively anyone and everyone is a priority. And that's why under this administration, we have seen arrests of course, undocumented folks who pose no public safety threat, people with lawful status, and sometimes even US citizens. What has motivated this administration's agenda has been politically motivated daily arrest quotas set by the White House, which are currently, a goal of 3,000 immigration arrests per day. These goals have placed immense pressure on immigration enforcement agencies and agents to use any kind of tactic possible to hit these daily numbers. As a result of this goal, which was set in May of this year, we immediately saw immigration enforcement agencies start enforcing, for example, in immigration courthouses in 19 states around the country, with ICE officers colluding with immigration judges, so collusion between the Department of Homeland Security and DOJ, immigration judges dismissing cases so that ICE could be right there to arrest people who were arriving for their proceedings. We also saw the agency increase and resurrect the use of worksite raids and worksite enforcement, effectuating the largest single worksite raid in the agency's history at a Hyundai plant in Georgia. Though that was by no means an exception, there have been other worksite enforcement events around the country. And of course, we've seen them start using large in-community raids, particularly in urban areas that are supportive of, democratic policies in Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland, Boston, even in cities like Nashville and Tennessee. These raids, of course, have relied heavily on racial profiling and targeting of folks based on where they're going to work, the language they speak, the neighborhoods they live in. And these profiling practices were recently condoned by the Supreme Court in a decision on its shadow docket. In addition to these indiscriminate tactics, the agency is enforcing immigration law now in sensitive locations or protected areas, which are places traditionally where we wouldn't see immigration enforcement. So that includes courthouses, but also near schools, churches, and other similar locations that had traditionally been off limits for enforcement. In addition to the way these goals have put pressure on the kinds of tactics the agencies are using, the immigration agencies do not have the manpower on their own to meet these daily arrest goals. Even prior to the Trump administration, 70 to 75% of all ICE arrests were made with handoffs from state and local authorities. And so to meet these goals, we've seen what we're calling at the council a realignment of the federal government. This is not only ICE enforcing immigration law, but now 20 to 30% of FBI, 80% of ATF, a significant percentage of the Department of DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, and nearly all of Homeland Security investigations, a sub-agency that was traditionally devoted to investigating child and drug trafficking. We've been underscoring at the council that this has disastrous results for the public safety of all Americans, diverting resources away from traditional public safety goals to low-level immigration arrests has meant, of course, that American communities are increasingly vulnerable to political violence, domestic terrorism, and drug trafficking. There were recently stories in the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian on the effects of this kind of diversion of resources, the way in which it's decreased the price of cocaine and fentanyl, the way that investigations into human and child trafficking have fallen to the wayside. In addition to the realignment of the federal government, we've also, of course, seen this administration lean into collaborating with state and local law enforcement agencies. The administration has increased the 287G program by over 600% since day one across over 40 states. This, of course, is a program that deputizes local police to directly enforce immigration law with minimal or limited training. But what's worth noting is that the administration has resurrected the task force model of this program, which allows local police officers not only to work as immigration agents in county jails and state prisons, but also in communities through traffic stops and everyday police interactions. 287G has existed, of course, across administrations, but it has a dismal track record on all fronts. It is notoriously bad for public safety because it undermines and erodes community trust in local police, making people afraid to report crime. A Tennessee police chief in the days after the raids in Nashville posted publicly that a non-citizen caretaker had failed to call 911 out of fear of calling the police given those raids, and the infant in her care died on her hands. These are the kinds of anecdotes we're hearing from sheriffs around the country. These agreements are also terrible for communities in the way that they increase racial profiling. In addition to working with state and local authorities, we've also seen the administration, of course, lean into military resources, invoking National Guards in states where governors don't support that invocation. Right now, this authority of the president to invoke the Guard in this way is being challenged in the federal courts. There's a circuit court split between the Seventh Circuit and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We expect the Supreme Court to likely resolve the question. Depending on that result and how things unfold, we could see the president invoke the Insurrection Act as a way to get around barriers to using the military for immigration enforcement. All of what I've laid out has really started before the signing and distribution of the money in the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed into law on July 4th of this year. That bill gives an additional $30 billion just for immigration enforcement operations, including signing bonuses for ICE agents, covering the cost of transportation and other operations. That money is what we're watching now very closely. We're seeing $50,000 signing bonuses being offered to newly recruited ICE agents. We know that over 100,000 people have applied to become a part of this workforce. And one of the biggest red flags has been the decrease in training and vetting for newly recruited officers. In addition to that $30 billion, there was another $45 billion just for the expansion of immigration detention, which is now at the highest levels in terms of the number of people detained in modern history. I'm happy to speak more if there are questions about the expansion of that part of the system, but the two primary takeaways to note: one is that the makeup of people in detention under this administration is different than what we've seen in the past. Right now, the overwhelming majority of people incarcerated in this system are people who have no criminal convictions. The second is that the vast majority of people in detention right now have no access to bond hearings where they can at least make a case for release. Our team at the council is releasing a report in 2 months on the detention system after this first year of the Trump administration to offer more updates. We are watching to see how these dollars will unfold over the next year, but unfortunately, we can expect the enforcement tactics and tools I've just described to increase in volume and probably severity as ICE and the enforcement agencies are able to multiply their manpower and bring on resources to support this agenda. So with that, I'll pass it back to Victoria. I'm happy to answer questions later on about any part of these updates.
Thank you, Nayna. We really appreciate it. Please keep the questions coming in the Q&A function. Our team will work on answering some of them live and providing additional follow-up links, but we'll also have time at the end of our conversation to circle back to some of these questions you're putting in the chat. But with that, I would like to turn it over to our state experts. And Gladys, I will hand it to you to get us started.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everybody. Gladis, Ibarra, she, her, ella. I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And I'd like to give a little bit of context to paint a picture on, what led to Colorado prioritizing data privacy for our residents. So in 2013, we passed the legislation that allowed undocumented, really anybody in the state to access driver's licenses and Colorado IDs, regardless of their immigration status. And then from 2013, fast forward a few years, and our state and our local ecosystem, nonprofit ecosystem, and community advocates are preparing to launch a rapid response network as a tool from the incoming administration. During Trump's first term, he campaigned on a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and led us to believe that our communities would be targeted. And in around 2018, 2019, through some of the calls that we received from community. We were studying them and trying to pick up trends. It was clear that ICE was receiving information from areas outside of the norm. When we launched the driver's license bill, we were working very closely with community and really listening to the needs, encouraged people to use the services that they qualify for, right? Driver's licenses being one of them. And so, again, continuing to study some of this data, there was a trend. And so our team decided to do an opens records request. And when we finally received that report, there was clear proof that our local DMV employees were communicating with ICE directly and sharing private identifying information, which was eventually leading to our community being apprehended and being targeted for being undocumented, right? And again, our goal here is to ensure that when we're working on any type of legislation and working directly with community, we are building that trust. And so when we're seeing these government agencies break that trust, we need to do something about it. So directly following that report, we introduced legislation in 2021 around data privacy specifically. So in 2021, this data privacy bill passed, and really what it does is ensuring that state agency employees are not disclosing or making private identifying information through any database or automated network or any type of PII that is not public, that is not easily accessible unless there's a warrant in place. And going further beyond making it accessible, that it's not being shared specifically for immigration purposes. One of the biggest pieces that we were also interested in was ensuring that there is accountability and auditing frameworks for how that information was shared. So 2021, fast forward, lessons learned, and now we're in 2025 under a new administration coming from, what our colleagues here are sharing, very strong against the immigrant community. And although we have some of these protections in place, seeing that, there's always room for growth, right, and strengthening. So I'm happy to share that, this year we passed very strong legislation that makes our previous state law stronger and brings in more accountability for people that are deciding to violate and willingly openly share information that puts our community at risk. So SB 276 that passed just this past session ensures that places like schools or hospitals, any other type of healthcare facility or libraries are actually saved for our immigrant families and mixed status families to access those services, right, that they qualify for. We're hoping that it improves the access to healthcare, to education, and really just community support all around. And we're also aiming to disentangle that immigration enforcement from local public services beyond law enforcement, because again, using some of, we're seeing different tactics, right? And using different entities to target the immigrant community. So through SB 276, we're ensuring that all of these local places have a policy in place to deal with ICE. That information is not being shared outside of, when there are judicial warrants in place, which should be the norm. But again, there's always people that are willingly ready to do this. So making sure that accountability stays strong with, and Victoria can share a little bit more information about this, but with actual fees, right? what is the word I'm looking for? Penalties that people are held accountable. This 276 expands from our previous bill that it goes beyond state government to local government agencies, which I think is one of the biggest pieces that I'm very proud of us to share, that it doesn't just apply to to state employees, but it goes to local governments. Again, these local agencies like libraries, like hospitals or clinics. Let me see what else I wanted to mention. The last piece that relates to information, private information, is removing an affidavit that was previously required to access some of these services like the driver's license or in-state tuition for undocumented people. That really, was creating just a pool of information that was unnecessary and that could be, used in bad faith at any moment, especially under administrations like the one we currently have. And so beyond not requiring that affidavit to access the services, this piece of legislation also ensures that any previous information is deleted, so that we're not just collecting information for the sake of it and putting our communities at risk. And again, we'll share maybe the 1-pager or 2-pager, since there's legislation can be a little bit dense sometimes, for y'all to look at the highlights there. So I'll pass it with that to Susan to share a little bit more about what's going on in your state.
Thank you so much, Gladys. And welcome everybody. So I'm from Massachusetts, and we are a state that has a right to shelter law. So I started my position here in, I think, 2023, which was for our state kind of the height of new arrivals coming into our shelters. And we had obviously an urgent need to immediately get people working, because we all know that that's why immigrants come to our country and to our state, is to work and to find safety. So I just want to give you a little background about how my job has gone from that to what it is now, because it's been a sea change. So back in 2023, until the election, we set up a number of legal services programs in the state. Almost all were directed at our shelter residents, because that was the obviously fiscal challenge to the state, is trying to get people in and out of shelter as fast as possible, since we're a right to shelter. So we set up something called the Lawyer for a Day program, where new arrivals could go to a family welcome center and apply for their work authorization, because they were paroled in, so they were immediately eligible, apply for their work authorization on day one, and often getting that work authorization within 2 to 3 weeks, because the Biden administration was obviously prioritizing work authorization, people working. We partnered with the federal government to run both EAD clinics, which are work authorization clinics, and temporary protected status clinics to get, when Haitian TPS passed, we got over 3,200 applications for Haitian new arrivals to get TPS, for whatever that's worth now, because it's ending in February, but at least it's given them some protection now. And similarly, we did the same thing for work authorization. So all that work in January had to be torn down, right? And we had to reconfigure everything. So we switched, and those were, I would say there's a pretty substantial amount of financial dollars were needed for that. What we have morphed that into now is, because, we're not seeing a lot of new arrivals into the shelter from obviously the border. So instead, we're seeing people who are in our shelter system, who are in a program where they're rented. We'd help them get landlord assistance, now not able to pay their rent, because the administration is withdrawing everybody's work authorization that they previously granted. So, a family has signed a 1 or 2 year lease. Our programs in the state help them resettle into those places, and now they don't know how to pay their rent. So not that there's a lot of great solutions for that under this administration's laws, but we did set up a help desk. And honestly, it's a pretty low budget item if you're looking at how you can help people in your community. Our budget for that is well under $1 million. And it's basically, we have 5-day-a-week coverage for lawyers, and they we have an automatic scheduling system where you just put your information in, and whatever zip code you're in, you're automatically assigned a help desk lawyer. Often that's best used to explain what the court system's like, or change of addresses, or kind of all the questions that state and local officials get all the time, like how do I change my address? This can be answered by a lawyer. And then if there's something, if they do still need an asylum application or further assistance, they will be referred to a lawyer to provide that. So there's limited assistance that way. That has been up and running since September, and we found it challenging to get the right balance of regions, like 0 appointments in one region and booked for 3 weeks in another region. So we had to play around with that. But ultimately, that help desk program helps all of our former shelter residents, anybody that left shelter in the last year, anyone that is currently in shelter, and anybody that is at risk of becoming eligible for shelter. So it's limited to that issue. And then the other thing that our state did, and that was in response to the change administration, was a bunch of defensive actions. Our first project was something called the Litigation Coordinating Group, where we called together all the legal-based and I'm used to being an immigration attorney, which is where all these ideas come from. We kind of pulled together all the nonprofits, big law firms, private lawyers, and ACLU types, and we put everybody on a weekly meeting in our state so that people in our state doing the work don't duplicate efforts constantly. And you know, ACLU filed a lawsuit challenging mandatory detention, and they explained to the group, this is what's going on. So that has been hugely successful. And I think in part because of that group, we were able to start a second project called the Habeas Project. And this grew out of watching, we're a very heavy student population state, right? We have so many big universities, and we were watching people like Rumesa from Tufts University getting ripped off the streets. And it was a big challenge to see how you can help people. So we set up something called the Habeas Project, where our immigration lawyers in our state, and most likely your immigration lawyers in your state, there's like 2 or 3 people who know how to access the federal online filing system for a habeas. And the only way you can, right now, the only way you can get people out of custody, unless they're a visa overstay, is a habeas, right? The only way you can keep people in your jurisdiction, because people are, especially in blue states, are being sent to Louisiana and Texas and Batavia, New York, is to file a habeas while they're still in your jurisdiction. And the trick is that most immigration lawyers either don't have time or don't have the skill set to file the actual document, the habeas itself. So we partnered with now over 300 federal criminal defense lawyers and civil litigators. And what they agreed to do is just file the habeas on behalf of the other people in the state, on behalf of the immigration lawyer. In that system, we can, like, within an hour and a half, we can get a habeas filed in an emergency situation. So that's been very successful, and that has been brought out around the country. I know Hawaii just called recently and asked for help trying to figure out how to set up their own habeas project. And we also set up something called the Legal Representation Fund, where the AG pays for, with private attorneys and nonprofits as subcontractors, the Attorney General has given funds to do bond hearings, bond representations. So last but not least, and this is our most exciting one, definitely not least, the legislature provided our state with $5 million. And that is legal representation for immigrants. The fund will go almost exclusively in the first year to people in removal proceedings, because that is the intense need right now. We will have kind of a structure, a 2-tiered structure. We'll have a new nonprofit whose goal is to really be a leader in the immigration law community that will bring some cultural changes to legal services, thinking about the way public defenders do their work and the way it's about the fight for justice. So there's a leader in the group, which is this, it's called MCR. And then the other is subcontracts with we're looking about between 14 and 18 subcontracts with private law firms, with nonprofits. And we in the state made a very deliberate decision to partner with private law firms because of our legal services were so overwhelmed after years and years of increases in migration and flip-flopping between Trump 1.0 and Trump 1.2. And that has proved very successful. They basically ran the Lawyer for a Day program. They are going to be some of the subcontractors in our program, and their capacity, I think, is different than legal services and much more in many cases. So that's our program. Our state has been fantastic, I think, in supporting the legal rights of immigrants. Our governor is a former attorney general. She knows what it means to have a lawyer. The statistics are overwhelmingly clear that sometimes some estimates are you're 10 times more likely to win your case in immigration court if you have a lawyer. And we've seen plummeting representation rates. In 2019, the percentage of people represented in immigration court was 62%. In 2024, track says we're down to 30% of people represented. So the need is huge. The success is obvious. And I know our state legislators get questions every single day. I need help. I need a lawyer. I need help. I need a lawyer. And they are a large part behind the impetus of this. I think that's my 5 minutes.
Thanks, Susan, and we'll pass it over to Helen.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name's Helen. I am the Immigrants' Rights Campaign Manager with the ACLU of Delaware, and I'm going to briefly talk about our successful campaign and actually banning 287G agreements in our state this past session. Just so folks know our timeline, our session runs January through the end of June. And January through April of this year, we were not really talking about 287G agreements. We did not think that we had a political path forward on moving a bill like this, or really even talking about this. This came because we were hearing from most elected officials in the state that they were scared of retribution by the federal government or some form of retaliation. And there was also a lack of urgency, or a lack of a belief that like the bad stuff would happen in Delaware. There was an overwhelming feeling that like if we keep our head down and we don't do anything, then nothing bad will happen to us. Not only were we hearing that from elected officials, some of our key immigration partners were also really in that mindset. And so it meant that we were trying to get partners on board and we weren't able to speak with like one loud coalition voice. The benefit we had during this time period is that a ton of folks, volunteers, activists, like tuned into our organization. So we were able to not only do a ton of Know Your Rights trainings during this time, but a ton of like skills-based activist advocacy trainings for folks on a number of different skills, so that when we had a moment that we were really able to like mobilize and get behind, we would have a really well-developed group of volunteers who could like spring into action. For our 287G campaign, that came during the first week of May when the town of Camden entered into a 287G agreement. This was the first agreement in the state, and this was entered into in complete silence or secrecy. We did not know until I happened to go to the ICE like 287G tracking website Monday afternoon, and all of a sudden Delaware was listed as having an agreement. Now, we got pretty lucky in that evening, the town of Camden was actually having a town council meeting where the mayor, the town council, and the chief of police were all going to be in attendance, and there was a public comment period. We were able to get on the phone with one of our key partners. Her name's Fleur. She's the head of the state NAACP who lives in Camden. And we said, hey, we need you to go to this meeting and ask them to confirm that we have this agreement. She went. She asked, and the mayor said to the town council, do not answer her. We are not talking about this agreement. She said that our two organizations were going to bring the fire, and we did just that. By 10 o'clock the next morning, our office had a press release go out. We had an action alert go out. We were FOIA-ing Camden at that point for all communications they had with ICE. And I was in meetings with some key legislators figuring out what is our pathway now to ban them. It has come to Delaware. What are we going to do? By 12 o'clock that day, this story had gotten picked up by pretty much every single major outlet here in the state. Partners were mad, elected officials were mad, folks on the ground were mad, and we were hearing rumors that Camden had withdrawn, but there was nothing public that we could rely on for that, so we were full steam ahead. Luckily for us, by 4 o'clock that evening, it was confirmed both on ICE's website and at that point by public comment that Camden had withdrawn. So within 24 hours, we went from knowing about this agreement to completely getting it out of the state and going back to having none of these agreements. But we weren't going to stop there. We had momentum, we had people paying attention, and we were determined with our last 6 weeks of session that we were going to push through legislation to ban this. We still, though, we're having trouble with elected officials, despite the fact that we got some initial outcry. There was a sense of, well, we beat it back once, we can beat back the next agreement we have. Our big kind of change moment came with a town hall we held in late May with our attorney general. She had been pretty publicly saying, you know, I am an immigrants advocate. I am fighting this administration. And behind the scenes, her office was opposing every single piece of proactive immigration legislation, including the 287G ban that had been introduced. We got one of our key allies here in the state, most respected immigration advocate, Maria Matos, to ask her about this. The attorney general could not answer that question. A week later came out with an op-ed that said, here is how I've been thinking. Here is why this Trump administration's actions and behaviors are causing me to change. And I now am backing every single piece of immigration legislation that is in the chamber right now. With that, shaky Dems were no longer shaky. Law enforcement was speaking out on behalf of this bill. And on the last day of session, we were able to finally get this bill over the finish line. We passed it with a 2/3 majority in both chambers. It was bipartisan in both chambers. We had folks showing up to give public comment, talking to their legislators, making phone calls. It was a team effort, but it was well worth it. It was signed into law. We became the 7th state to ban them, the first to do them in Trump 2.0. And we actually did it without any sort of retribution coming after the fact by this federal government. And so it's really kind of given us a lot of hope and a lot of energy as we are pushing now for other wins here in the state come January.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all sharing your expertise and about the work that you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and turn to some questions that we have, and then we'll visit the chat for questions from our audience as well. Can you, Gladys, Susan, Helen, can you just share a little bit about how your issue and the policy solution for your issue was messaged both to lawmakers and the broader public that ultimately helped the efforts to be successful in your respective states?
Yeah, I can jump in. I'll say, since I'm referencing like 2 different eras, it feels like, the fight for immigrant rights has always been a fight. In Colorado, I recognize that, we kind of live in a different bubble than a lot of our neighboring states. And, in 2021, we led both in the state capitol, the directly impacted stories, doing a lot of the lobbying with the community, did a lot of work within the community to ensure that this was the right move. Ultimately, we've also always had really good allies that we can rely on, both to help us with their colleagues in shifting votes when needed, but also publicly speaking about immigrant rights. And in fast forward to now, I think it's a little bit of a different reality with the messaging. We have, tried to use broader language beyond immigrants and immigration, because truly any of the policies that benefit immigrants or are focused on supporting immigrants or keeping immigrants safe make everyone else by default safer, right? As being one of the targeted and vulnerable populations in our country. And so, yeah, the road to passing legislation this year was slightly different, still involved community. And I believe that was also one of the questions in the chat, right? And maybe worded a little bit different, but still involved our community, right? We have steering committees and folks, give their input. But I will say that it is a different reality in 2025. Even Dems, even folks who have historically said that they support immigrant rights, are shifting, and we've seen that shift slowly come over the years. Over 2023 and beyond, I think folks were a little bit more scared to talk about immigration, and so while it was a challenge, the messaging publicly, remained a little bit broad. We were thinking, because Colorado, Denver have had a target on our back as the current president was campaigning, right? We were thinking beyond passing legislation, how can we ensure that this remains in place? And if or when it's challenged, what do we need to think about and and just how we talk about the issue as a whole. So I think that was the mentality on working through the campaign and in the conversations that we had both publicly with our members. It was a little bit hard, right? It's hard for people to say, like, or for people to hear sometimes. We need to frame it a different way to ensure that it passes. And I think within the Capitol, folks sometimes are already used to that kind of strategic conversation where this is what's going to help pass it versus not. So that's all I'll say for now. I'm happy to expand, but I'd love to hear from our friends too.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in really fast. Publicly, we did a lot of talking about 287G agreements allowing our local and state law enforcement to be just like little force multipliers for ICE out in our communities, and talking about, like, we're seeing the violations that they're doing, the aggressive tactics that they're using. Like, we don't want more of that in our communities. And that was really an effective rallying cry for the greater public. In our conversations with law enforcement and especially elected officials, we steered away a little bit more for that and instead talked about wanting to make sure that, like, all communities, but especially immigrant communities right now, felt safe and comfortable to go talk to law enforcement, given that we know can be victims of crime, given the increased hostility that's going around. Making sure that that community trust is really important. We talked about that this is spending state and local resources doing immigration work and taking those away from the important roles that are already going on. And then we talked about how they cost a lot of money. The federal government at the time did not provide any financial assistance for that, and they could also be opening themselves up to a lot of legal liability that the federal government would not help with. Really struck a chord with a lot of folks. So little bits of different kind of messaging, but I think we found a good way to talk to both groups.
And if I could just jump in, so I left it for last, but the money that our legislature is providing for immigrant representation in court is very, very, very clearly a direct response to what's going on under this administration, right? And so these sometimes are opportunities. I saw this in Trump 1.0, little old ladies walking people into ICE offices and trying to step in front of an ICE officer is something that absolutely nobody would have ever dreamed of under the Obama administration. So one thing to think of is that this very serious crackdown is an opportunity for progress, and $5 million in our state is 100% a direct result of a reflection of their policies and the extreme enforcement efforts that we are seeing on the streets. And so that's, take advantage of the opportunity. It's a terrible way to say it, but this is a way to push back. And this is a reflection of FOIL. Your state can be the state saying we want people to have due process. Our program is 100% designed around due process, about the right to representation, about everyone has the right to a lawyer. And then for when we were doing all the work around the shelter system, we had a terrible labor shortage in our state. And we were partnering very closely with employers. Employers are feeling the brunt of what's going on here. It's difficult to get them to talk, but they are, many different industries are suffering extensively as a result of just the wholesale delegalization of people, right? People who were legally here, people who had work authorization here suddenly find themselves without. Neither. Employers in our state have invested, thousands of dollars into these employees and trained them. And we had one guy he worked at Market Basket for 3 weeks and he was made a supervisor, right? Like these are employees that employers were really desperate to have, and now they're going to lose all of them in February. So thinking about it as an opportunity to push back on some of the stuff that we have never seen this $5 million if Trump hadn't been elected, in my opinion, right? So that's the way we think about it.
Really quick, thank you, Susan. I'd like to add a little bit more. I think, my focus here is sharing on the private identifying information, data privacy. And for the most recent bill we passed this year, this is a piece of it, but there's it's kind of a bigger umbrella. Our angle was to really codify civil rights, especially for immigrants in Colorado. So just to the question, and how we were messaging this bill or how we were talking about it, we were really just trying to ensure that everyone understood that what we wanted was to uphold civil liberties, right? And to ensure that there's like due process and everyone is treated the same and everyone has that opportunity to fight their case and also to feel safe. So I just wanted to add that. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Nayna with a couple of questions, Nayna, so I'll just give them to you back to back and let you answer them. The first one is, are we seeing U.S. Marshal agreements with local jails being amended to include ICE arrests as well? And then secondly, why can't we sue ICE for violations of Fifth and Sixth Amendment? Since we're saying that these people are criminals, then it should trigger constitutional protections. Could you address those two?
Yes, let me address the latter, and then I might need to circle back on the first just to make sure that I'm offering an accurate answer on the contracts between marshals and prisons and how that's implicating the detention of people in immigration custody. But on the latter, so the thing to remember, first of all, is that even when the immigration enforcement agencies in the White House are using rhetoric around immigrants being criminals, even when they are enforcing against immigrants who have criminal convictions, what they're doing is enforcing civil immigration law. And so any of the constitutional rights that apply to people that are put into proceedings or being apprehended by ICE, are the ones that apply in the immigration system. Now, of course, there are constitutional rights when it comes to law enforcement and how they treat people that are the same between both systems. So, the right to ask for a lawyer before answering questions, the right to require a judicial warrant before someone enters private property. Those constitutional rights are the same between the two systems. But something like a Sixth Amendment right to confront your accuser that applies in criminal legal proceedings, that has never applied in immigration removal proceedings. There is no right to cross-examine a police officer, even if the immigration judge is using a police report to determine whether or not someone presents a public safety risk. On the Fifth Amendment side, of course, due process does apply to non-citizens, but it is an abrogated version or lesser version of due process than what applies in criminal proceedings. And so just because they're using rhetoric talking about criminality doesn't change that what they're doing is enforcing civil immigration law. And therefore, any of the constitutional rights that attach are the ones that attach in the immigration system.
Thank you, Nayna. And then we have a couple of questions for Susan. First, how time-consuming, labor-intensive are habeas cases, and what's the timeline for those? And then secondly, are there legislative efforts for record sealing for immigrants that have past convictions that are examples of nonviolent, as they might be higher possibility of being targeted?
Okay, great questions. And then can I just add one thing onto this motion, this evidence suppression issue? That's one of my favorite topics because people don't understand this. There is a right to a motion to suppress an immigration, but it's close to useless because it's so hard to get. In criminal court, if the police come into your house and they barge in with no warrant and they take, the 2 kilos of cocaine out of your bedroom, when they go to state court or federal court and they say to the judge, I took these 2 kilos, convict this person of possession with intent to distribute or trafficking, the federal or state judge will go, well, did you have a warrant, right? And if they didn't have a warrant, the drugs get thrown out, the case gets dismissed. There really is no corollary in immigration court, right? What are you suppressing? It's the person that's going before the court. So it's a real hole in the system that there isn't a check. There's really no check on ICE's power, really. And so it is a very big weakness in the due process protections of immigrants is there is no check on the agency most tasked with enforcing it. Sorry, that's one of my favorite topics about reforms that we need. Okay. So habeas can be insanely complicated, taking 16 lawyers and a lot of work, and it can be so much as filing a 2-page document. And it really depends on the type of habeas you're filing. So for example, right now, the administration is interpreting absolutely everybody in the earth except visa overstays as mandatory detention, meaning they cannot access bail in immigration court in front of an immigration judge. Our federal judges we are filing in our state between 2 and 5 page habeas petitions explaining that they're violating the law with this Hurtado case, and our federal judges are ordering bond hearings, pro forma, almost at this point in time, because there's been so many petitions filed. I think we're up to over 100 habeas petitions between September and today, which is huge. That's actually a big number. But then, of course, there's much more complicated ones. It really depends on the facts of your case. The thing I love about the habeas project is sometimes these criminal defense attorneys who've never stepped inside of an immigration courthouse in their life get super interested in the issue and start doing all the work for the immigration attorney, which with all the work that they have to do is a very welcome thing. And then you want me to do the legislative effort. So sealing is absolutely 100% never a protection for immigrants in immigration court. It does not help at all. Even a mass vacate. So I believe California and a couple of other states did a mass vacate of their convictions for marijuana. Even those are vulnerable under the law. Because the way the law works is that a motion to vacate a conviction in order to prevent the immigrant from having the consequence of that conviction has to be based on statutory or constitutional grounds. So if a state makes a policy saying, yeah, we're really sorry, we didn't want to convict all those marijuana users, I think that's a very vulnerable conviction for immigration court. It may not be vacated for immigration purposes, even though it's vacated for state purposes. Certainly, and we know in New Hampshire, somebody that had a California conviction vacated under a mass vacate program was held by CBP for weeks until he was finally released. Sealing is 10 times worse. Not only is sealing problematic in that the immigrant can't go get their documents to show their lawyer, right? Because so they don't keep the copies or they lose the copies, then it becomes a problem for the lawyer. But FBI still has access to those documents and ICE still has access to those documents, and they can still hold somebody based on those convictions. If you are a state legislature and you are looking at doing a protective issue around vacating convictions, I just urge you to speak with a really competent immigration lawyer in your state that understands your state rules and your state criminal laws and your immigration procedures.
Thank you, Susan. And Gladys, I saw you come off of mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that part of SB 276, there's a small piece on there that focuses on improperly entered guilty pleas. So, we have seen and anticipated, right, that immigrants with specific types of charges would be targeted. And if not targeted, wanting to adjust status, seeing that they couldn't because they had specific things on their record. So again, yeah, feel free to, especially for all the policy nerds, dive deep, but there is a small piece in our bill focusing on that so that folks can actually have the chance to adjust their status.
Yeah, thank you. And then Nayna, do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're hearing from sheriffs around the country on 287G agreements, and some of the work you've been doing with law enforcement?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Victoria. We've been in touch. We've been, creating a task force of law enforcement leaders around the country who are willing and wanting to push back on mass deportation and many of these practices for our federal advocacy work to try to expand the coalition of folks, speaking out on this. And given that we're doing that work, we are starting to hear from both Republican and Democrat elected sheriffs who are really tracking in real time the fear communities are feeling about reporting crime. And we've heard from many Republican sheriffs about the way in which the signing bonuses for ICE enforcement agents from local police agencies, and that is of significant concern to them. And then on 287G agreements, sheriffs that are in counties nearby to counties that have those agreements are seeing the public safety and erosion of trust impacts even when they themselves have decided not to enter those agreements. So it just underscores, for those who are trying to push for state laws that prohibit 287G agreements or restrict cooperation via detainers or any of these other kinds of protective policies regarding collaboration. These public safety points are not just abstract, they're becoming very concrete for law enforcement leaders themselves. And we're happy to share kind of where they're publicly stating that. We're hoping to get more of them on the record so that states can build the support they need to pass these kinds of protective laws and policies.
Thank you, Nayna. I appreciate you bringing that all together for us. We're getting close to the end of time, so I just want to one kind of last, not easy, but not the hardest question for the advocates on the call here. Can you share quickly if there's been any scrutiny of the policies that you've talked about in your states? If so, what has that been, and what advice would you have for any policymakers, state legislators, local city county officials on this call who are considering advancing similar policies in their states? Gladys, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in first. Yeah, I'd love to. I feel like yes, but not locally. I do think, locally we, at least our bill sponsors and our partners, we all remain strong in our decision to push pro-immigrant legislation forward and hold the line on anything anti-immigrant always. I think the general public, and really depends on in which angle you're looking at. Every effort that we have is always politicized, rightfully. And interestingly enough, we have had a few shout outs indirectly and directly, from the president himself because of the policies that we pass. So I feel confident in, what we're doing and how we're approaching keeping our families safe. And the only advice I would have for anyone who is interested and excited about exploring something similar or anything pro-immigrant in their state is that you bring in those directly impacted voices to hear from them actually what their needs are, because we're very easily make assumptions, even just based on what we're seeing on social media, right? That what we think we know what the needs are. And if it's possible in one state, and however we can be partners, whether it's directly or through our coalition, passing SB 276 was not a singular effort. It took every ally we could find in the state, both as individual or as an institution, to ensure that it made it through, and the government did sign it, even if he tried to hand over information a few days later to the government. And so, any advice I would have is that, it's never too late. It feels kind of defeating right now, but I think every effort will send a message to the right community of, where you stand, and whether it's possible. I think the last thing I'll say is, Colorado was a very different place 20 years ago. And so we didn't get here overnight. So every effort, in the end will make that difference.
Thank you. Susan or Helen?
I was just going to say, we have people asked a question, what can your state do? We have a driver's license bill in our state, which honestly is incredibly key right now because it reduces the number of people going to court for driving without a license charges, because our courts are filled up with ICE officers every day. We have an in-state tuition bill that has been incredibly popular. Now we have a legal services bill. One thing I forgot to say is we have always had an alien warning statute, which requires that anyone before they're taking a guilty plea get told about the consequences of that guilty plea. And that is often a very important tool for criminal defense lawyers to go back and vacate a conviction. So if your state doesn't have an alien warning statute, that's a pretty invasive, I guess, statute to pass that can have a lot of things. So think about all those things if your state doesn't have them. And I think a lot of that flies well under the radar. I think 287G is like poking, right? Like, I think that's right where they get the maddest. So there's other things. If your state isn't got the stomach for that, there's other things to be done.
Thank you. And Helen, want to bring us home?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I know we're right at time. But to Susan's point about poking the bear, actually, I was really worried about that, as were a lot of our partners, as we were looking more and more like we were going to ban them, and did. One thing our partners really pushed for was that they didn't want a lot of news coverage about what happened. So while a lot of like Delaware publications talked about that we had passed this, I really don't think, you saw it in like the Washington Post, or it wasn't on CNN or MSNBC. And like I said, when I had my 5 minutes, like we didn't see any kind of retaliation. We didn't see a big increase in ICE activity here in the state. We did it quietly, we did it quickly, and we didn't get any consequences for it. And so I think that that is how we are kind of moving forward, about like we can get these wins here, we can keep them kind of off the stage nationally, is sort of the blue point we're following as we are looking at like how else can we cut down cooperation with ICE, how can we ban profiling based on immigration status. We know we're going to try and protect sensitive locations here in the state, and so I think we're trying to keep that like quiet celebration strategy in place as we keep pushing forward.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know we're at time. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We will be sending a follow-up email with the recording as well as links to the different policies that we talked about and additional resources. Please do reach out to our team at the council if you have additional questions, follow-up information, or you would like to be connected to resources in your community or any of our panelists to kind of provide their expertise for you. Thank you again, Gladys, Susan, Helen, and Nayna. We really appreciate you being here with us today, and have a great afternoon, everyone.